Rough seas might pull me under and dark clouds might dim my days. There's always bright tomorrows when I close my eyes and say, remember how you've made it through the fire. Remember how you've come so far. An unstoppable force of nature. Yeah, that's what you are. I know all that I have lost has given me the purpose of conquering my pain through love. I sing this hymn to rise above. I am a mountain, and down in the valley below is all that I've overcome. All that I've overcome. Oh, I am a mountain, and down in the valley below is all that I've overcome. All that I've overcome. I was born to be one. Whatever life may throw, I'll pass the test. Whatever dream might come me next, I'll stand with my head to the sky, unshaken by thunder and winds in the tide. I know all that I have lost has given me the purpose of conquering my pain through love. I sing this hymn to rise above. I am a mountain, and down in the valley below is all that I've overcome. All that I've overcome. Oh, I am a mountain, and down in the valley below is all that I've overcome. All that I've to be one.
Good morning. What a great start to our time together this morning. Welcome to church this morning. I'm so glad you've chosen to spend this time with us, especially if you're visiting, you're new, it's your first time here, you're especially welcome. So, welcome. My name's Becky. I'm part of the team here, and I'm going to be leading us through our time together this morning. And we're going to have a great time this morning. We are kicking off a brand new series called If I Could Tell You Just One Thing. But not just that. We have the excitement of a guest speaker. We've got Emma with us. Emma lives in sunny Bournemouth. And Emma works for a charity called Star Recovery. And she's got an amazing story that she's going to come and share a bit of with us.
Hello. Wow, oh my gosh, that worship. I'm Emma, lovely to be with you here. Like Becky said, I'm from Bournemouth and visiting my boyfriend's family actually close by, so it was just perfect to come and speak to you today and kick off this new series, which is If I Could Tell You Just One Thing. Oh my gosh, I absolutely adored the worship, and it just does something to me. You know, when we're all together in a sort of collection of people listening and singing and just, I don't know, it centers my heart. And there was a lot of talk about hearts in the actual words. And I tell this to worship pastors and musical teams because it changes their walk with how they see worship, actually. And there's a clinical sort of study about hearts and how they beat when we actually worship together. And it's actually proven that when we worship together, our hearts start beating at the same time. And I think that is stunning because it changes how I perceive how when we're all together worshiping. But I also believe that when we come together for the same purpose, the same mission, the same reason, we can unite together and change things. And that's sort of my story, which I'm going to come to in a little bit. So I just pray today that what I speak about through my story and obviously the word touches some people's hearts in a way that they maybe hadn't expected. And I'll tell you a little bit about me, because I think it's important you know who this random stranger is coming here to talk to your church family. I've got to know Becky for a few years now, and I know their hearts for people that are broken, and that was my heart once. There was a time where I didn't want to live anymore. I turned away from God. I turned away from everything I believed in, and I'll come to that. But so you know a bit about me and my character. This is not my normal setting, speaking in front of a group of people. I'll be honest. Back in the day, my biggest fears, one of them was public speaking. And when I was at university, if I got asked to do a talk, I would shy away from it. I was physically sick because being in a room with more than 2 people filled me with anxiety. So this is out of my comfort zone, but God also pushes us out of our comfort zone. And this is why I want to talk a bit about we can get stuck in our boat, and we're going to refer to a biblical story in a minute. But we can all get stuck in places of comfort, but also when we're in fear that stop us from fulfilling everything that God has for us. But I've got quite a spontaneous nature. If you ask me to do something, I rarely say no, even if I'm scared. And I've got a love of adrenaline. Next Saturday, I've agreed to do a Tough Mudder, if anyone knows what that is. It's 15 kilometres, 30 obstacles. I'll be honest, I don't like water. Obviously, I wash, things like that, but I don't like swimming in it. I don't like, my boyfriend started me paddleboarding, and I'm pushing through that fear and doing it anyway. But anyway, this Tough Mudder is about water, it's about mud, it's about ice pools, it's about running through electric. I don't know why I'm doing it, but I've said yes. I'm doing it for charity because it means something to me. But back in the day, I've done a skydive. I've got this nature that I can't just stop at one thing. It's almost like that next thing. And the world tells us this, that we're not content in where we're at. The world is telling us that we want the next thing to buy, the next person. Look at the way of internet dating and things. Not happy with one, we'll just ditch them, we'll go to the other. And the world is telling us this, that not to be content in where we're at. But anyway, so I did this skydive. There's me doing this skydive. I'll tell you a little story about that in a moment. But then I decided that wasn't enough. So I then decided to do a wing walk. And in Bournemouth, we have a great air show. So there's me on top of the plane doing a wing walk. And then a few months ago, I actually flew a plane. So it's good to have these ideas, but I don't know when I'm going to stop. It's crazy. I have to, think about this. But with the skydive, it was quite a funny story because I was with that chap that I'd never met before, and he's attached my back, and I was with some of my colleagues from a charity I was working with, and we literally were sort of up in the air, and my colleagues went out, and they jumped, and I was the last one to go out, and I was sitting on the edge of this plane looking over, and then we went out, and oh my gosh, I was like hyperventilating. It's like nothing you've ever experienced. If anyone's done it, you know. And I was like, I'm going to die. And then literally we sort of like were descending, and then I felt this water in my face. And there's me, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm hyperventilating, I'm going to stop breathing, and now I've wet myself. This is like... And then the chute opened, and it was, perfectly still and silent, and then it was beautiful, actually, and I opened my arms, and I was just like, praise God, it was just lovely. And as the chute opened and it was silent, I said to the chap, I said, have I wet myself? He said, no, my dear, you went for a rain cloud. And I then enjoyed it, And I got to the bottom and I thought that was it. But then I saw my colleagues in the distance, and I was working for a Christian charity, and I went bounding over because they were kneeling in this field, and I thought they were praying. And I went over and I was like, Lord Jesus, thank you for this experience. And then I realized they weren't praying, they were being sick. I've always got a funny story about things. I love storytelling. So I'm going to tell you a bit about my story and what's brought me to here today in a bit. But, like I said, we live in a world where we always want more. Not everybody, some of us can find that contented feeling, but the reality is that there's always the next thing, the next best thing. What can we get out of this world? And we look more to things rather than to people in many of our settings. And that instant gratification culture is programmed into us from external things in the world today. So, you look at social media, the likes we get on social media and things like that, it gives a dopamine hit to us that makes us feel good. So we want more. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But the negative part of that is that we actually lose sight from God because it becomes about self, it becomes about us, and we get stuck in places. This is why I've called this, stepping out of our boat. We can get stuck in places that are not good for us and healthy. And with this, it comes fear, because we know we're not in the right place, but the fear of actually stepping out into something is very daunting. It's scary. Change is scary sometimes because it means we have to make changes. So we're going to look at a scripture in the Bible, a passage in the Bible, in Matthew 14, verses 22 to 33. And just to set the scene, just before this miracle that happens, Jesus and his disciples have just fed the 5,000. They've had quite a heck of a day, to be honest. And now they're on a lake, and this story happens. And I want to talk to you about this because there's some things in it that, it's only through reading it that it really kind of resonated with me, and I believe it's something I wanted to deliver today. So if you've got your Bibles, or we'll bring it up on the screen, I'll talk you through this, and then I'm going to unpack it a little bit for you. So like I said, it's from Matthew 14, verses 22 to 33, and if you're following online, you can follow it too. So immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up onto the mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. And I'll be honest, I think I would be if I saw someone walking on water. And they screamed, "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink, crying out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and he caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." I mean, this is a massive verse, a massive story in the Bible, and we refer to it quite a lot. And for those that aren't familiar for it, this is one of the miracles that Jesus performed, and the disciples were there and they saw this happen. But it's about courage, it's about faith and boldness, which we all carry in different ways. But we also do, I know I do, sometimes take my eyes off Jesus and focus on the problem rather than him. And in that's what happened to Peter. He took his eyes away. He focused on the storm that was all around him, lost sight of Jesus, and he started sinking. And in that moment, and this is a clinching moment, he actually reached out and asked for Jesus' help in that situation. And the thing that I love about this is that Jesus didn't condemn them. He didn't condemn Peter in the slightest for taking his eyes off of him and onto the problem around him. You know, he actually said, "You have little faith. Why did you doubt me?" It was almost like a encouraging kind of mentoring, like, not "you done wrong." It was like, "Why did you do this, Peter? You know, I love you. You know, why did you do that?" So that Peter could think about this. And actually, in that thinking, he took power back and he actually looked back at Jesus and asked for his help. And I find that so encouraging. And imagine if we lived in a world today where we didn't condemn people for the problems that they're in, the sin that they're in, the mistakes we make, and actually just walked with them and encouraged them and mentored them. That's my experience. That's what people did to me. And I believe that is one of the biggest reasons that I am able to stand here today and be with you and to speak about, you know, my story about this. And it takes courage to step out of a comfort zone when we're stuck in it. And for me, you know, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story, and I give all the glory to Jesus for this, because I don't believe in any human power I could be where I am today. And I come from a really well-to-do family. You know, admittedly, my dad wasn't around, but my mum could not have given me anything more than I had. She was, you know, I remember she used to take me to church. You know, I sang in the choir. It's a very traditional Anglican church. I'll be honest, I quite liked the communion wine. I used to always offer to clean out the sort of goblet of the wine. It was very traditional. And my vicar lived next door to us, and I would always be the one, the good little girl, Christian girl, that would say, "I'll feed your cat when you're on holiday." And I'll be honest, I'll tell you a little secret. I did feed the cat, but I also knew that he had a really good wine cellar. And I would sneak into his wine cellar at quite a young age, and he had this extensive array of red wine, and I would go in, I'd take a bit, and then I'd top it up with Ribena. And I didn't think he'd know. I think you might be able to get the gist of where I'm going with this in my life. But I was always a little bit sort of devious, I'll be honest. But I'd put on the mask of going to church and being the good little, you know, girl and doing everything right. But then behind closed doors, I was very insecure. I wasn't comfortable in my own skin. It didn't help that I was bullied at school. I had food allergies and different things, and it excluded me. But I don't blame any of that on the path I took. However, I fell into the trap of not liking Emma anymore. And in that, my outward pain became an inward pain, which I ended up going down the route of eating disorders. It started at the age of 11. And at the age of 13, I found alcohol. And alcohol became almost like my best friend at the time. And it bubbled away to the point of being about 15, 16. And I realized I was relying on that to help me to fit in. And in that, my path with God, yes, I was turning up to things, but I was feeling much more disconnected because it started becoming all about self, about what could I take in order to manage my life. And hindsight's a wonderful thing. I'd love to look back at all the decisions I made based on alcohol, which I now know was addiction bubbling away for me at a very young age. And I started drinking excessively. And to the point where, I mean, it got so bad. I mean, I did well at school, and then I went to university, and they offered me all these degrees. And I remember going to Cardiff University, and I didn't know I had a problem with drink. I think deep down probably I did, but I just thought I was a heavy drinker, social drinker. And the lecturer then, he said, "Well, you can pretty much do any of the degrees you want to do here. What would you like to do?" And I said, "Well, what's on offer? Name 3 and I'll see which one I like." And he said, "Well, there's sports recreation." I thought, that sounds far too energetic. I'm not doing that one. I always had an excuse for everything. You know, I look back on my character. And then he said, "What about business studies?" And I thought, no, that sounds far too clever. Honestly, I'm not belittling anybody that's done that. It was just my kind of... And then he said, "What about hospitality management?" And I'll be honest, I didn't really know what that meant. But the lecturer said to me, I said, "Well, what does that entail?" He said, "Well, there's wine tasting on a Friday." I've never moved so quick. I grabbed the pen, I signed the thing. I was like signing up to a 4-year degree based on that decision. And I didn't know I had a problem with alcohol. And university was a playground for me. There was a lot of fun I had, but it also fueled. I could master things. I liked every sport going because then I could drink with different people. I used to I had my own golf clubs. I went to rugby, all these things, I ended up liking, Formula 1 was a good one because we'd have parties for the Formula 1. And I remember one time we had this new game where we'd put all the drivers' names in a hat. And it was a drinking game, and everybody would pick out a few of the drivers' names, and every time the commentary mentioned that name, you had to drink. And if anyone knows Formula 1, I picked out Michael and Ralph Schumacher at the time. I didn't even see it to the first bend. I was paralytic, and I'm not belittling this, but I'm just trying to paint a picture of how alcohol kind of crept in to my life. And I left university, at university even, I remember a time where we used to go out drinking with the Welsh rugby team, and Welsh rugby teams are renowned for drinking quite a lot. And I remember one time the Welsh rugby captain, he looked at me when we were out in a pub and he said, "Emma, don't you think you drink too much?" And most people would have taken stock of that and maybe, thought about it. I didn't. I was elated. I was like, that is amazing. What a compliment. And that's how my life kind of became. And at the end of university, in my wisdom, I went away abroad, ran nightclubs abroad. And I'll be honest, there were times in that time where I felt so stuck, but I didn't know where to go anymore. I see that God had carried me so much. There were drink driving episodes. I ended up on probation, losing my driving license for the second time of 5 years. And I ended up, thankfully, being able to go into a 12-step rehab when I was 28. And this is the picture that they took of me. And bearing in mind, that's 16 years ago. I was broken. I literally, if you'd have asked me anything apart from what my name was, I didn't know it then. I was so cross with God at that time. Why did this happen to me? And I have to be reminded of this. It's not just about the physicality, but I was absolutely broken. 2 litres of vodka a day, just wanting to die and give up. And I remember going into that rehab, and it took about 12 days for the alcohol to wear off and the medication that they gave me to wear off. And I remember laying in my sort of dormitory type bed and saying, God, if you can help me get through this, help me to help other people in the future. And I started to turn my eyes towards him. I felt I was still stuck in a rut at that time because I didn't know who I was, but I felt I was given an opportunity to start to know him more. And the 12 steps originate from a group of Christian people like Alcoholics Anonymous, and they started talking about God. And gradually, bit by bit, I was like, I know who that is. I feel like he's way over there for me. But bit by bit, that was the most beautiful thing, aside from being able to get free of alcohol addiction. I'd love to stand here and tell you that I never drank again. That is not my story. A bit like Peter when he took his eyes off Jesus, he started sinking. I took my eyes off my recovery. I took my eyes off Jesus as well, and it became about me. I got complacent, I got arrogant in my recovery, and I ended up drinking again. I'm just coming up to 11 years sober, free of a drink. So 11 years ago, I ended up drinking again. That's when I ended up on probation. I went straight back to square one in a way. But the minute I started focusing on the healthy things, and it was hard, I'll be honest. I knew I was at a crossroads at that moment, and I could either carry on drinking, knowing what the consequences might be, or I turned and I gave my all to follow a path of recovery. But for me, it has to be a spiritual path of recovery, and I'm so blessed that I know for me that is God and Jesus. And basically, I started on that path 11 years ago, and I'd love to say, for those that maybe don't know many people in addiction, the sort of preconception is for many that we get free of the drink, the gambling, the pornography, the drugs, the social media addiction, and then everything's rosy. Well, that isn't the case at all. Life still happens. Life still is pushing things in our direction to be people that God didn't intend us to be. Those instant gratification culture feeds people's, character when they have that sort of addictive nature. But anyway, I remember something that happened, and I'll talk about it later, but that so many things have happened in recovery. And one of the things, that prayer I prayed way back when I was in that rehab and said, Lord, please use me, help me to help others. I remember in that rehab saying, I'm never, ever, ever working in addiction. A bit like, when I said I'm scared of public speaking. God often uses some of our biggest fears and will turn them to good for those that love him. And that's been my experience. I believe that our battles can be our blessings. I believe that our mess can become a message today. And I believe that we all have that ability in us. And I want to talk a little bit, about addiction, just so that we understand it. When I talk about addiction, I know for me, even having lived the life I have since the age of 11, where addiction took hold of my life, I perceived addiction as your park bench drinker or somebody in a crack house injecting it, heroin into their arm or crack cocaine or, but I've realized today that addiction carries so much stigma and connotation. And I'm here today to talk a little about that because actually, when I say addiction, we look at destructive habits. We look at compulsive behaviors. And there's a study out there that I read that 80 to 90% of people have a destructive habit or a behavior or as full-blown as an addiction that if they were free of, they would be happier. That is a lot of people. That will be people sitting here today. And when we talk about addiction, I'm going to skip through a few things, but there's a great quote that I came about with one of the biggest factors I believe that is influencing people today, especially young people in our society. And it's a quote from a book I'm sort of reading at the moment called Dopamine Nation. And it says, we live in a time of unprecedented access to high reward, high dopamine stimuli, drugs, food, news, gambling, shopping, gaming, messaging, sexting, tweeting. The list goes on and on. The smartphone is the modern day hypodermic needle, delivering digital dopamine 24/7 for a wired generation. We've all become vulnerable to compulsive overconsumption. And I guarantee if I took everybody's phone off them now, if people have got mobile phones on them, and said you're not getting it back for a week or even a day, I guarantee, the many people will actually experience a bit of anxiety because a lot of what we place in the world today is in digital format and things that feed that dopamine. And the same with social media and things. And I'll be honest, like I said about what people's park benches are. My park bench was not in a grotty area on the side of a town in a dark alley. My park bench was a beautiful home that became lonely. It became isolating. It became dark. And everybody can fall into that trap. And that's why I think to dispel the talk about what addiction and compulsive behaviors are. I mean, I went to watch a course running once, a recovery course in London. And I'll tell you this story because it helped me to change how I perceive addiction and compulsive behaviors. And basically, I was put in this little group of ladies. We had a group where there were separate men's and women's groups. And there was a group of ladies, there were about 8 to 10 women in this group, and I was invited for the session to watch it running before we started it in Bournemouth. And I got to this group, and most of the ladies were my age, and there was one little old lady, and I'll be honest, she looked like my late grandmother. She was ever so cute, and I thought she must have been somebody's gran, bringing them along just for support, which a lot of people do, because this not only affects the individual, it affects the whole family, as we know, if you've been affected by people with addiction. And so we went round this group, and there was a little, everyone was sort of explaining what had brought them there, and they'd all said alcohol or crack cocaine, heroin. And then it got to this little old woman, and I thought she'd just pass, She was just sitting so cutely, like, if cutely is a word. And anyway, she just said, "Oh, Emma, I've got a habit." And I was like, "Oh, interesting." And anyway, she said, "Yeah, it's I've got this habit, and it's the first thing I do in the morning, the last thing I do at night. I spend all my money on it." She'd been married to her husband for 50 years, and he was thinking of divorcing her because of it. And by the end of all this sort of catalogue of things she said, I was out of my seat. I was like, "What is it?" And she said she was addicted to cross-stitch. And I was like, cross-stitch? I was like, that's something my nan used to do. That's like knitting. And the pain in that woman's face, I had to take stock of how I just, it is funny. It's like, what? And the pain in her eyes was not dissimilar to when I was drinking 2 litres of vodka a day. But the reality was that habit had become so compulsive and obsessive in her life that it was her waking thought and her last thought of the day. Spent all her money on it. No dissimilar to somebody that's going out and buying heroin on the street in some ways. If anything, more painful because she's not numbing it. And then I've met so many people along this path of working in recovery now. A man brought his wife to a course, and literally he said, could he sit at the back and just learn about the course so his wife with the alcohol struggles could actually benefit? We said, yeah, of course you can. And he sat at the back, and then at week 3 he came up to us and said, Emma, can I join one of the men's groups? I said, yeah, but you sort of need to qualify. And he said that he had been, he recently got married. He'd been on honeymoon with his wife, and the whole time he had a problem with biting his nails. And again, I must admit, I nibble my nails, but it was so problematic in his life that was his thought all the time. When could he go somewhere in private and actually bite his nails? And he said it took his whole focus off what should have been the most beautiful time on this honeymoon with his wife. And this is the thing, I'm trying to dispel the idea we have about what is compulsive and unhealthy in our lives to the point where extreme is addiction, but there's other things that can bubble away. We met someone the other week that's actually addicted to eating polos, and we were like, what? She told John about it, and she's having, her teeth are rotten because of it. She's thinking about it all the time. And it's taking her eyes off. And I'm going to bring you back to, why we're here today and what we're talking about. Because I genuinely believe that if we know a little bit about addiction, we can change how we perceive things. We can actually walk alongside people and help them to come out of what they're stuck in. That boat, help them to focus on him rather than the problem. Of course, we have to address the problem. Sometimes there's physical reasons we have to address the problem of addiction, but actually when we have a relationship with God, things change. And that is my experience when I see people with addiction, that hunger to change and bring God into the center. So if I could tell you one thing, I think my main thing, obviously I talk about choosing, are we ready to step out of our boat? But also, I want to share a story with you which really kind of encapsulates for me something that happened in my recovery. So this is, I want to take you back to something. It's great because my memory got shot to bits when, through all the drinking that I did over the years. But so dates and names and things are not my forte. But something happened on the 12th of the 12th of the 12th. I deal with a sort of number, so I remember exactly when it is. And my whole path with Jesus changed that day in one of the most horrific moments that I've ever been through, but also one of the best in a way. And I want to share with you what happened. I'd taken my mum My mum's amazing. So I was 6 weeks back from my last drink. So just to put it into context, when people have drunk again, or drank again, following time in sobriety, it's incredibly hard. The shame I felt like a baby in this again. And I didn't honestly know if I was going to get a sustained recovery again. And I was a bit stuck in this sort of boat that I'd created of uncertainty, of fear. But I decided to make some positive moves forward out of where I was. And one of them I chose to do was to actually continue to do the things that I'd set up before I drank, even though I felt fragile. And this is the thing, it's about pushing through those fears. Even coming up here and talking to you today, I got anxious, but today I embraced the anxiety because this stuff means something to me, And anyway, I'd taken my mum away. She'd always wanted to go to Iceland. And I need to reiterate that it's Iceland, the country, not the frozen food store, because somebody one day came up to me and said that was a really cheap amends, taking your mum to a frozen food shop. And I took my mum to Iceland. We went searching for the Northern Lights. She's such a godly woman. She's been my inspiration for years. And she was in my flat in Bournemouth. And we got up, in the morning, and she was about to drive back to Wales. And I remember actually, it's funny because God just reminded me, we were talking, we were praying in the morning. And the day before when we got back, I was talking to a friend of mine who lived in this shared block. And we were talking about God. She didn't have much of a faith, but she was exploring it. And I was saying, sometimes God just puts people in the right place at the right time. He comes alongside you in your hour of need. And in that moment, we were my mum and I were talking. The next thing, she just falls on the floor. And I thought she'd just fallen over. She hadn't. She'd had a sudden cardiac arrest in front of me. And there's my best friend, my mum. We even share the same birthday. We're so close. And she's literally on the floor, and she's grey. And the air's coming out of her body, the noises, the smells, the sounds. And I see this woman just dying in front of my very eyes. And in that moment, I grabbed the phone. I called the paramedic, I did 999, got the ambulance on the phone. Back in the day where it would only take 8 to 9 minutes for an ambulance to come, it was the longest 8 or 9 minutes of my life. And in that, I ran and got my friend. And this, for me, was God just doing everything so beautifully. My friend was home. It was her birthday. She would normally, every single week of the year, be working that day of the week. But because it was her birthday, she was there. She's the lady I've been talking to about God showing up in our hour of need. And I literally got her. She'd done her CPR training 2 weeks before. We both went in and we just started CPR on my mum. She was doing it to Nellie the elephant. I was doing it to Vinnie Jones, staying alive. Ribs were cracking. It was one of the most horrendous moments of my life, not knowing what was going to happen. And in that moment, when the paramedics came in, just like things get busy in our lives. Things just get crowded. And sometimes we just need to step back. And I stepped back. I remember stepping back and I started praying. I started praying the serenity prayer, which we use in our 12-step fellowships. Grant me the serenity and the courage and all these things. And I was saying it out loud. And in this chaos, I felt this peace just fall in that room. And it was like nothing I've ever experienced in my life. And the paramedic that was shocking my mum's heart, he turned around to me after trying about 6 or 7 times and said, "We can't do any more." How often when a problem's so bad do we give up? I know I do sometimes. And in that moment, I pictured someone else in that room, and I know it was Jesus, without a doubt. I can't tell you exactly what he looked like, but I just knew the presence of him so close, and I focused on that. Like Peter did, he went back and looked. When he was sinking, he looked. And I looked to him. And then these words came out of my mouth, and I looked at the paramedic and I said, "Please, can you try one more time?" And in that moment, he did, just to appease me. He told me that afterwards, that's what they do. And her heart started. And I saw my mum come back to life. You know, and the message I want to say today is that we only need to know a fraction of what someone's going through in their problem, their pain, their addiction, whatever it might be. We don't have to have all the answers at all, but we can walk with them into a place of hope, into a place of freedom. And all we need to do is just be there and walk with them and reach out our hands when they ask for help. Just like Peter did, just like I feel like I did in that moment with my mum. Those times where I said, I'm scared to go into a rehab, but I'm going to put my foot in front of the other and do it. You know, God is in the business of restoring lives that are broken. And if this is you today and you know that this has touched your heart about something that is troubling you, it doesn't have to be as full-blown as an addiction, but something we turn to that we know is not healthy in our lives. I ask you to maybe, as we worship, give that to God, speak to someone, pray to someone, pray with someone. Secrets keep us sick. And when we bring things into the light, he can do so much more than we could ever ask or imagine. And I'm just going to leave that with you as we worship. Amen. Thank you so much for letting me share with you. And my mum is brilliant, by the way, today. She's got a lot of health things, but she is just an absolute warrior. You know, and God is good, so good. And he can restore hearts today and things that are troubling us. So I'll leave that there.
If you'd like to all stand with me, we're going to sing our final song together.
Feet may fail,
band. That was fantastic. What a great time we've had together already. We've just heard Emma speak, and I'm just going to ask Emma to come, and I'm just going to ask her a couple of questions to recap some of the things that she shared. Thanks, Emma. What you shared was amazing. Can you just recap for those of us who are watching online, what was the main thing that you wanted people to take away from this morning?
We could all get stuck in a place that is really uncomfortable. It could be a place of brokenness, a place of just, absolutely our lives could be shattered, or they could just not be feeling right. But today I've been talking about my story, my testimony, but that we can, as long as we keep our eyes focused on Jesus, we can get out of whatever boat it is that's not good for us into a place of hope and freedom. So it's been a pleasure being with you.
Well, thank you. And if people have really engaged with what you've said and feel like, you know what, that's me, I need to get out of that boat, what's one step people could take practically as a result of what they've heard?
I would say that Jesus looks at people rather than the problem. And I would say for people to actually come forward and speak to somebody about whatever it is that's going on for them, because that not only invites people in, but it also invites Jesus right into the very centre. And then hope happens and transformation and freedom.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Emma. That's great. Thanks for clicking online and being part of us today. We'll be back next week where we'll be in part 2 of this series. So come back and join us then.